Good afternoon and welcome to this year's Evening with the Holberg Prize here at the House of Literature. And I'm sorry if I kind of make up my mind if it's afternoon or evening already. But anyway, my name is Kari Jegerstedt. I usually teach gender studies at the University of Bergen. And it's my great pleasure tonight to moderate the 2025 version of this annual conversation between the winner of the Holberg Prize and the winner of the Nils Klim Prize. I will try to keep my introduction to the prize winners short, as I know that both of them have a lot they want to say and our time is limited, and also because I think most of you here already know who they are. But anyway, help me welcome the 2025 Holberg Prize winner, Professor Gayatri Chakravorty Spivak, named by the Holberg Prize Committee, and this characterization is actually super precise as one of the most influential global intellectuals today. Professor Spivak is trained as a comparative literature scholar and currently holds a position as university professor at Columbia University, yet also teaches at elementary schools in rural India. Spivak receives the prize for her long-standing interdisciplinary work, reshaping several fields of studies, including comparative literatures, translation, political philosophy, pedagogy, and feminist theory, asking us all to foster a global criticality. To my left, the 2025 Nils Klim Prize winner. And the Nils Klim Prize, as you probably know, is awarded to an outstanding and promising young researcher from the Nordic countries, Associate Professor Daniela Alaattinoğlu. I'm sorry, I tried to practice. Who currently holds a position in the Faculty of Law at the University of Turku. Her areas of, yes. Her areas of expertise are social legal studies, gender and law, legal mobilization, human rights, reparations, comparative public law, and criminal law. In her research and teaching, she is especially interested in how societies and laws evolve in tandem, how groups mobilize to change their position, and how law intersectionally includes and excludes individuals and groups. We will, I hope, have ample time to hear about and learn from their work as we go along. However, I wanted to start this conversation from a somewhat different angle, also because the format of this talk allows us to be a little bit more personal. So when this year's two winners were announced on the Holberg Prize social media platform, a commentary in the comments field below the announcement quickly occurred. The feminists take the prizes. I must admit that I was somewhat puzzled by this comment, since I did not know how to read it. Was it celebratory, jubilant, yes, at last? Or was it derogatory, critical, a form of microaggression? I guess I could have found out if I researched it closer, but I was kind of like a little bit content that it struck me that my puzzlement was symptomatic of a whole range of discussions that are going on now and have been going on for quite a while. What is the value of feminist research? What is the value of anti-racist and anti-imperialist research? What is the value of social justice research? Is it research into really important issues that we desperately need more knowledge about and new understandings of? Or is it, as its opponents would have it, a kind of woke activism that threatens the basic structures of moral society? Or quite
Sorry,
bluntly.
communist and lunatic. These are the words of my king.
Or is it just kind of like a complete waste of taxpayers' money?
There we go.
This pushback, or the pushback on these kinds of research, have only increased in later years. In Russia, in Hungary, in India, in Argentina, in Denmark, in Turkey, in the US, and several places. In what is, I would say now quite bluntly, perhaps, an effort to secure white supremacist, heterosexist, capitalist patriarchy. So,
Quite bluntly.
quite bluntly. So I wanted to begin by asking you to reflect on these issues and on your own positionality within academia at this moment of time. You both work with structures of inequality globally, outside of academia, but you are also part of the very unequal structures within academia. And you, Gayatri, has several times during the couple of these 2 days asked the question of why is it that recognition arrives so late for some scholars, like yourself, like Angela Davis, like Horton Stillers, pointing to racist and sexist structures within the field, of which the Holberg Prize, sadly, and we know this, is not an exception. You, Daniela, have been a passionate advocate for increasing representation and supporting unrepresented groups in academia. Amongst other things, you have been protesting the student tuition fees, which they also introduced in Finland. They have done the same thing in Norway, which apply to certain non-EU students, but potentially to all students, which makes higher education less accessible to people from working class or poor backgrounds. So these structures deals with who you are, what you look like, and where you come from. Yet also, as I tried to outline above, the fields and research questions with which we work. So maybe I'll just give the word to you first, Daniela.
Okay. Well, there's a lot to take in there. I would also actually like to hear more also about Gayatri Spivak, your work also in teaching in the...
Gayatri is good.
Okay.
The American.
Okay. Sure. About also your work teaching in elementary schools, and maybe you can also tell us a bit about that. But would you like me to start it with my own positionality, or...
Well, how do you feel, both personally and professionally, these kind of pushback against the kind of research you're doing? Is it a problem in your setting? Is it less of a problem? How do you perceive it? How does it look like from your perspective?
Yeah, of course, these are questions that we are increasingly asking ourselves these days amid the attacks and pushbacks really on gender and sexuality studies, anything called feminist, and that we can also see so with social media, these attacks are becoming taken to a new level, and we are also getting, I have also gotten this kind of, I guess many of us these days who speak up about gender issues and, for example, talking about trans rights is often something that I tend to receive lots of hate emails and these kinds of very derogatory transphobic comments often. But that said, of course, I'm in a very privileged position in academia, and mainly, in many human rights issues and concerns, these are kind of questions that I'm involved with, not from my personal perspective, but sort of more looking at the sort of structural, different forms of structural oppression and how law creates and recreates that. That said, of course, we can see, and this is maybe not relating so much to the pushback, but also thinking about, I think it's important not to just be reactionary to those pushbacks and attacks, but also sort of trying to think about the future and sort of what kind of world and what kind of academia we would like to build. One hopefully that is more inclusive, and that's something that we were talking about that also yesterday in the Nils Klim conversation, that I think it's important to interrogate beyond these kind of outrageous attacks and pushbacks also, the curriculum, how is it designed, which courses are mandatory, now talking about legal training, which are considered as sort of central to the law, which courses are elective and considered less important. Those are often my courses. But
Mine too.
Yeah, yours too. That's great. But I think those are also, I think, of course, it's important to talk about the pushback and the growing rise of authoritarianism and attacks on human rights, on feminism, on anything seen as so-called woke. I'm not even sure what that is, but yes. But also, yes, trying to think broader and keep in mind, what kind of academia and world we would like to have. Maybe some initial thoughts.
Yeah.
I would like to begin by saying, as you know, Kari, since you've been, and indeed you told me that you too liked my work, thank God. So, because legal scholars, they can go either way, as you well know.
Yes.
Dismiss the humanities as, just very nice, but that's all. But at any rate, as you know, I have been critical of academic feminisms of various sorts. I have been critical of, class-based feminism, etc. But now, because we are really feeling all of that stuff against feminism, it's time for people like me to be with everyone within feminism. I'm at this point that I've withdrawn that critical edge. I don't think it's the time now for us to be carefully critical from inside so that feminism, etc., etc. I hope you agree with this, because I think we have to show a united front. This is my feeling. But it is also true that I have a tremendously bad reputation within this social media. I don't do social media, you see, so that I hear this from people who either despise me or people who care for me. I'll tell you a story. I think that's much easier than just sort of talking in the abstract. I was invited recently by the Oxford Union for a debate. I generally don't do these things, but it was focused on feminism, and I thought, well, this is the moment for me to say yes. So I said yes, and they were very nice, okay? Then, when I wrote saying, in 2 weeks later or something, would you please let me know the details of what you want me to do, then I can begin preparing for you. She responds, it's a woman, she responds by saying, there was so much interest in this subject that too many people have joined the panel. We will have you come at some future time. So I wrote to her saying, am I correct in thinking that you're disinviting me? Because it had never happened to me before. I have no doubt that this social media stuff, someone told them. Gayatri Spivak, bad elitist Brahmin person who's nice. I've heard that these are the things that are on social media. I'm not quoting, it's hearsay. Anyway, so I think that, can you imagine? And the woman responds, yes, that's what it is.
And you accepted that? Or
well, of course I did.
You had to.
Give me a break. No.
But did they invite you back?
No. Would I go?
No.
Never again. But then, there's more to this story. Someone they got because of course it was a lie. It's a debate. What do you mean, too many panelists? So they got someone, an intellectual, a feminist intellectual, to be in my place. And she, this feminist intellectual, said to them, "Are you crazy? You had Gayatri Spivak and you let her go." So that's what they wrote to me, that Professor such and so suggests that we invite you back.
Okay.
I didn't even respond. No. Sorry. And after that, I don't know why, Cambridge invited me. Okay. Okay, the great game. Now, the thing is, it's a less interesting subject, I'm sorry to say, but I immediately accepted. because
Well done.
Because whatever game was being played, I was an object there, and I had some meaning. So I thought, whatever the hell the meaning is, I'm going to discover it.
Indeed.
Okay, so this is the kind of position that one is in. I will tell you something else. I checked with my lawyer, and I can make it public up to this point, but not more. You wouldn't believe that from females, especially one female in the upper administration at Columbia, I have been accused of being racist against white people.
Oh.
How do you like that in the white supremacist country? Huh?
Yeah.
So I may be a university professor, but I can't say very much more. But this is a fact. And this for 5 years now. Because it is now a legal matter, I can't discuss it. But this much I can say. Can you imagine that? That in this context, Gayatri Spivak, at her place of employment, for 5 years has been accused of being racist against white people. I write on W.E.B. Du Bois. Was he racist against white people? It's a very strange thing. So I just am telling you this because it is also part of this.
Yes.
See, because one is not like the receivers of diversity, grateful, thank you for recognizing me. One doesn't thank the authorities for being a visible minority. You know, one notices how different it is when you are an old colored woman. But even at my place of employment. So that's another story.
But it's also become like very symptomatic of general U.S. policy right now. When you give asylum to white South African because of racism, and what I was wondering, I don't know how much you can talk about it being in the U.S. Academy, but of course what's happening there now is really scary to us. All the things that you cannot do research on, all the firings that are happening, all the courses that are closed down, and it must be such a completely difficult terrain to work in, basically. And what I'm also thinking, because we think, oh, it's not going to happen here, but they did think the same thing in Netherlands, and it started to happen. So what I kind of sometimes feel is that I'm in this Handmaid's Tale movie when they look back and think like we saw all the signs, but we didn't do anything, and now it's too late. I don't know if you want to comment on that.
Do you want to go first and then I'll say something? Is it too late?
I just also on the previous point about also racism and how that is now exploited or used by white supremacist movements, really, as I think it has been a strategy for quite some time to use concepts that have been used by different movements on the left and different minority groups, and kind of positioning themselves as a minority and completely, of course, disguising that position of power, but seeing that they've had also some success, which is also before courts is, I mean, a very, as you say, it's very disturbing and a very worrying trend, and of course it's also something that I think we should never think that we sit safely. And I was talking also yesterday about, we're talking about Nordic exceptionalism and talking a bit about that also earlier today. And we have this notion in the Nordic countries that the Nordic countries are so progressive and defenders of human rights. And I think that can be, well, it can be quite a dangerous notion. It's also, I think, quite a nationalist notion and uncritical in that sense. I think it's also important to really question that thoroughly. And to see the movements that we have in all the Nordic countries, also white supremacist movements that are not now talking about, well, increasingly about, for example, birth rates, that there are not enough white people being born, not enough white women having babies. And I think we can see, I mean, part of my work is also historical, really remnants from the 1920s, 1930s, similar discussions were going on about which kind of people do we want to reproduce, which kind of people shouldn't reproduce. And we can see these narratives. I mean, they haven't gone anywhere, but they are really resurfacing now, also with feeling this kind of comparative strength from other countries where these movements have really become the dominant power.
And at the same time as they ask white women, or they ask women to give birth to more children, but obviously they mean in the Nordic country white women. And at the same time they're returning migrants that came here. I just was a little bit shocked earlier today because I saw that. Someone I know fairly well is also under this threat now. Perfectly integrated, super nice kid. It's shocking.
It definitely is. And I think this whole migration discourse has been part of it. I think also more what we would call, well, maybe center-left and more progressive political movements have also been sort of instrumentalizing migration and saying, okay, there are fewer as kind of a solution to this demographic problem, that there are not enough babies are being born and migrants will save us. And now we can also see this instrumentalization now being turned the other way around. Yep. I think both are problematic in that sense, but definitely, I mean, the migration discussion has always been a part of it, but now it's now migration is not seen as part of the solution by many political movements. People to work, and then now we need them to live, and then like they are good or bad or superfluous, like after. How do you? What do you think about the situation for your work in the U.S. now? Because I know there's a discussion. Like a lot of people in Europe, we want to grab you. To like have all the excellent researchers in Norway or in the US come to Europe. Do you think that is a good solution, or is there ways to resist the system from within where you're at, and is that a better solution?
It's really strange that it becomes difficult to answer that question. I mean, I have lived in the United States for 64 years, as I was saying. I taught there at a university for 60 years. Okay, I became a tenure-track assistant professor in the fall of 1965. So to an extent, my life has been as much American as it has been anything else. But the thing is now, and I was very interested in working there because it can be, that place can be as dangerous as it is powerful. And therefore, I felt that teaching there, teaching all of these students, thousands of students, if you think about all of this time, large classes. And so therefore, I had thought that it was a kind of, because what are the humanities? They're a species of electoral education, how to do democracy, what it means to cast a vote. So I had felt quietly I was doing something both at home, where the largest sector of the electorate are my students, and they are democracy as arithmetic. How many can the tyrant take by grabbing and giving, not mind but body, how many can they take? So there was, in my sense of things, Europe did not really play that kind of a role for me, because what had happened after the Bretton Woods was that America slowly had taken the place of that super-power, Cold War, etc., India and China rising. I felt that there was a place for someone like me in the US and in India. It was cut out. But I can't answer that question anymore, because I teach at Columbia, and we know that Columbia occupies a special place of shame now. And the idea that we have to censor ourselves in order to be helpful to our students. And it is shameful also to censor ourselves, but we must do so in order to be helpful to our students, because talking about migration, in the US, just to enter for seeking asylum is a criminal act, and you can be arrested, you can be deported for just that. I mean, I'm thinking about a woman weeping and saying, I don't want to die in Honduras. So in this kind of a situation, how can you make up your mind, especially if you're 83 years old and being accused of racism and so on? You can't go away. You can't go to Europe for succor, because I'm also part of a 87% majority in supposedly, according to CNN, the world's largest democracy. And, we often, I was talking about my sister, we often say to each other, is this India? To each other, because taking a situation of the relationship between India and the United States, Donald Trump saying again and again, I solved the war the possibility of war between India and Pakistan. You have to think about not going away to Europe. You see, so to that extent, it's a negative answer. But on the other hand, I'm not sure. Because, life's coming to an end. I'm an old person. How do I want to end my life? So this is, you asked a very important question to me. I don't know. I don't know where I would be happy with people who are thinking in the same way. We are very divided now, very divided.
Yes, and everything, all the signs were there, but even this change happened really quickly.
And therefore it is too late.
Yeah.
Before it was too early. Because we couldn't imagine this change. We couldn't imagine. It's a failure of our imagination that this could happen.
So, but not talking about Columbia, but also kind of pointing to Harvard, that have now tried to sue the state in order to kind of uphold some certain basic academic rights. And actually that brings me into your field of work, because lawfare or the use of the juridical system to secure some basic rights seem to be becoming more and more important in later years, and also in the situation in the U.S. And that is something that you have been working a lot on, how you use law to secure basic rights. And you have worked on many different things, but I just read last night your excellent essay on the rape laws in Finland and how they have been changed. You pointed out that most of the rape, disturbingly number of rape cases were dismissed because it didn't fit how rape was described in the penal code. And then there have been a lot of work to kind of adjust that. So now you have more stress on consent, which means that you have a better functioning law. But what I also wanted to point out to is that you are also critical towards how much does law fair and the laws help. And I just want to because this is extremely important work, but as you also point out in this excellent interview that the Holberg Prize uploaded by you, you say that laws and legal reforms cannot alone guarantee justice.
Yes.
The most promising legal approaches are those that are accompanied by broader structural and institutional change. For example, reforms that center survivor voices and addresses the systemic failures of law enforcement. Accountability and justice require more than legal tools. They require political will, intersectional analysis, and sustained social movement pressure. And that also made me think of your article on rape culture, which even asked for more than that. You're talking about like not only rape, but a rape culture in India and beyond that actually asks of us to some extent, and I will have you kind of deepen this in the...
Can you just tell me which article you're talking about? Because I've talked about this in so many areas. Do you kind of roughly know?
Yeah, no, it's the article to Judith Mitchell's.
Oh, that was a very different thing. I'm asking people to be able to imagine the transcendental as rape.
Yes, exactly.
Oh,
yes.
Anyway, carry on.
But it's a completely different way of talking about rape, because there you're
Nancy
asking...
Fraser was made so nervous by this that I had to write a whole thing so that Nancy would be calm. She's an old friend. Anyway, carry on.
No, but you talk about this rape. But what you're trying here is actually to have us think that just the entering into humanity is a form for rape. And if we do understand that, we're also complicit in a rape culture. And the only way, on what that asks of us, is more kind of radical epistemic changes of how we think about the human or how to dehumanize. And that also brings your imaginative training into relief.
But we mustn't confuse this with the horror of rape.
No,
that is why it's so hard to imagine.
Precisely.
All the, Leda and the swan, and Europa and the bull, and Buddha's mother, and many, many, many other stories. We mustn't confuse that with the horror of rape. The two things are...
It's two things, but you also point at to try to redress what can be called rape only by making and enforcing laws in the name of humanity is not enough. And I think you're talking to each other here, but on different levels and in different ways. I know this was a really complicated question. I'm sorry, but can you just help me and just take over from here and kind of like say what you mean by that?
Of course. So, I mean, in that context that I was writing about, and in conversation with, was that, so we did this research project where we looked at reported cases of rape that had been closed in Finland, and I read through all the files from the police and the prosecutors and the first instance courts, and we were looking into sort of the reasons why that happened. And we did that as a project because the Ministry of Justice, at the time the Finnish Ministry of Justice, they wanted a consent-based definition of rape, but they didn't want to, or they wanted to understand better what was the problems inherent in the old legislation, which, I mean, there are also other people, and the researchers I did this research with, Heini Kainulainen and Johanna Niemi, they had been, we've been writing about these problems for a long time, but of course this was a kind of an official report to do that. So Finland established a consent-based rape law a couple of years ago, and back then there was there had also been mobilization around it from civil society, and a lot of pressure on this consent-based law. So what we also were writing about is that, well, and of course other feminist scholars in particular have been writing about also the danger of putting too much trust in legal reforms and new laws, saying that, well, this doesn't necessarily solve everything. Of course, it's a welcome change, but if the same judges are there and the same law enforcement officers, and we still have kind of the same ways of thinking around sexual autonomy in general, well, we are not sure that so much will actually change. It's kind of a broader problem than that. So that was actually what we were writing about back then. And we are seeing these problems actually now occur in practice. There has been one case recently in Finland that has been discussed a lot in a case of a reported rape that in the opinion of many, should be considered as rape, but doesn't, according to it's still in the court, so the court of first instance has not qualified it as such. So we are also asking ourselves, sort of, well, what is the real change of law here? And I think now maybe not talking so much about rape, but more about law, I think again here it's also important to always interrogate how the law works in practice. And maybe trying to also demystify the workings of the law in that sense. Now, I'm not sure how much that speaks to your scholarship in this case.
Of course it does.
Yeah,
I mean, you know, I'm more practical here because I'm not trained in legal studies. But what I say over and over and over again in defense of the humanities is that if you change laws, exactly what you're saying, you don't change minds.
Yeah.
They're not isotemporal change. I've been saying this forever. You know, it is just that there be law, but law is not justice.
Yeah.
It's that, and you know, this is a quote from Derrida, but Derrida writes it in The Force of Law in a very different way. You know, and I certainly respect it, but the way I use it is quite different from what you see in The Force of Law. So, in fact, this conversation with Romila Thapar, not this one was on India, but we talked on justice. You know, there was a thing. And I said to Romila, the idea of justice. And I said to her, and she's a wonderful historian, right? I'm fortunate to be her friend. I said to Romila, think of the sense of justice, not the idea of justice. Because more you think of the idea of justice, the more it gets separated from actually what's happening. Think of the sense of justice. So to an extent, I'm absolutely this way. And I would like to say, point at the rape that happened at Ajikar Medical College in Calcutta, which I think made international news finally. Yeah. And it was, I'm very pleased that men really took, I mean, not all men, obviously, but there were male feminists there who really were concerned. I wrote a piece in Frontier on this, because that seemed to be the appropriate place to write it. And you know, I made exactly this point that, you know, because Nirbhaya, the one who had been raped before, who also became, her mother had said, well, the laws were changed, but nothing changed. And absolutely what you and I are talking about. Yes. And, you know, some people also said, in terms of that rape, in a doctor who had gone to rest in a room where, because there were no resting rooms for female doctors, and she was gang raped. And, you know, I said one thing that was not being noticed was that there was blood and skin under her nails. She fought. This is a fighter, not just a victim. First of all that. And, you know, it was reported once and then not again. So to an extent, I was saying to the men and the women that you have to, you know, what you and I are talking about, you have to think about how people change rather than how good laws are very nice. Yeah. It is absolutely important. I mean, how many public interest litigations are we involved in? Many. Because it's not that one doesn't believe in changing laws, but that is not an end.
Indeed.
So I'm absolutely, and in fact, it will never be an end.
No.
So there, I'm very much with you from a less, you know, I mean, legally untrained position. I'm very much with you.
Could you, because you have expressed interest in Gayatri's work, could you say something? Is like her training of the imagination for social justice, is that a term that is used within your field or a way of thinking within law?
Oh, okay. I think it depends really which kind of lawyers you would ask. And as you said, lawyers can go two ways. Or more than two ways. So I think there are definitely very interesting initiatives, centers, thinking, for example, about the Center on Law and the Humanities at the University of Melbourne, and ways and socio-legal scholarship. A lot of socio-legal scholarship is also about kind of broadening the legal eye or interest in what is considered a legal concern, and more about sort of access to justice and the relationship between law and justice. But of course, that is only part of legal work and legal research, and some other kinds of legal research or legal work are maybe more focused on, well, doctrinal perspectives and kind of what are the prevailing rules and principles. And of course, that is an important part of legal work, but I just don't think we really need the broader perspectives. I think we really need perspectives. We were talking about that also in the panel today. We need these interdisciplinary perspectives, insights from anthropology and broader humanities, social sciences, really to understand how the law works in practice. And there are those initiatives, but I would say that, again, talking about what is compulsory, what do lawyers have to know, it's maybe not, it's quite rarely seen as part of the sort of mandatory training. And I'm particularly sort of trained and have seen the European perspectives, and I think that's particularly true in Europe, that we tend to be quite traditional in the way that we imagine and teach the law, unfortunately.
You know, in Africa, the concern with custom can be very interesting in answering this question that you're talking about. I'm thinking not just of older lawyers like Mary Mabureke. I'm thinking also, for example, the man who was dean of the law school at the University of Ghana, Legon. He's no longer dean. You know, he really thinks that the only way to think about law in the African context is through the humanities. We should pay more attention to these people because one must not think of custom and law just in the model of tradition and modernity. So, certainly in Mozambique, before the current conjuncture, there was also, I've been talking with Bern a great deal in terms of one of my former students, Juan Obarrio, who did quite good work with that. So it seems to me that we should, because of this very active, not really problem, but situation. I'm glad right at the end you said in Europe, because yes, we must. This is why I was very pleased with Emily saying I'm produced by this Trump situation. As soon as we do this kind of a thing, then we begin to see these other places. So I would say we should put Africa in here because the problem and the work is very, very active there. In fact, with the white South Africans coming in, we really have to think about the work at the University of the Western Cape, Premier Shlalu's work, those kind of people who are actually thinking about how to relate this. So I just want to put my, and in terms of Nordic countries, the Piketty, his book. Up to 1991, the Scandinavian countries are his model because, you see that suddenly in 1991 it stops. But he never asks why. Right. And, there is a piece I wrote quite a long time ago on, I gave it in Lund. And I remember Oscar Hamer saying, after I had finished giving the talk, which I must say that Stefan Jonsson had really helped me with all kinds of research. I told him, Stefan, send me as many figures, as much statistics as you can about the migrant situation. It was some time ago and in Sweden. And he gave me like everything from, he was at that time, I think, editorial something at Dagens Nyheter, which is a very important, I'm sorry about the pronunciation, please don't mind, but you know what I was talking about. Right? So, and then, therefore, I was able to actually talk about the laws changing as the visible minorities are coming in.
Yes.
And therefore, when we worked for Nicaragua, we said what would happen with the Sandinista, Scandinavian model socialism. But that changed completely. And so therefore, it's possible to see why this happens, so that one can be safely just, exceptionalist, socialist, all of these things, a model for the world. And then in come the darkies, and things are ruined. Visible minorities. And so this is something that, I wrote on it, and Oscar said the only person who actually talked about politics in our conference was a foreigner, about me. And, I was so pleased that it's published, in fact, in a book edited by Feng Chia and Bruce Robbins. It's an old piece, but take a look at it. I would ask you specifically to read it and see what you think now. You know what I mean?
Can I just follow up a little bit about this discussion? Because I hear you saying that we need interdisciplinary perspectives in order to understand how law functions better. But when I hear you talking about interdisciplinarity or humanities as a kind of like supplement, it's not only about understanding how something functions, but also to create a change in how we think about the phenomena. Is that right, or am I?
Well, in my case, I must say, of late, the last 10 years, 20 years, I'm so old that when I say of late, it's like a big thing. It seems to me that activist scholarship, which is the only kind that I can think about. Two little stories here. One of them, little stories, 1899, Du Bois walking down toward the post office in Atlanta, he sees a very well-known story. He sees a little thing which says that Sam Hose's knuckles will be available at some, he had just been lynched. And he said, he saw that. And then he said, he writes, I realized at that point that the way I was doing, and he was establishing the discipline of sociology, really, there was nothing. And so he says, I realized that the way I was doing scientific sociology was not worth doing. When he saw this advertisement in a shop window openly that Sam Hose's knuckles will be available as souvenirs down the road, So he said, he uses there the word propaganda. He says, the way I must now teach is propaganda. And this is one. On the other side is Antonio Gramsci, who says the modern intellectual must be a permanent persuader, not like the traditional intellectual who simply describes and so on. And I'm influenced not only by this, I'm influenced by the people I work with, both at the top and, to quote Schoen, below. So you see, when I teach these people, I see that, and I say to them that, the idea that the humanities are not activist is just intentional fallacy in our thing. That's a Cold War idea, and you think that's just a correct idea. No, in fact, this is a practicing kind of work, and so in this activist work, what you do is you think of it as a relay race, not just as something you describe very well as a historical narrative, but you should think of it as taking the baton and running in another direction. So that, what Emily was doing with Faulkner, for example, is a bit of a relay race. So it's certainly a different kind, a different way. And so I ask myself, what am I? Nothing but someone teaching in an institution. But I can also be capable of thinking relays. So it's this way of thinking is what has happened to me because of the two examples I gave: propaganda, permanent persuasion. That's a different mode of thinking about what the role of teaching is. It's not just law. I of course greatly admire my fellow university professor, Joseph Stiglitz. And he's a wonderful guy. Joe is a wonderful man, concerned with all kinds of things. But because he became impatient with the fact that people in the so-called global south were not following his ideas as they should, now he's all into enforcement.
Right.
And enforcement is like a temporary thing. It can be temporary for 100 years, but nonetheless, it's a temporary thing. We don't want enforcement. And to go back to an 18th century European idea, and also elsewhere, as I was saying, one must train how to want the law. It's, and I was in the ethical forum of the World Economic Forum, ethical committee. And so I had to consult people constantly. And so I went to Joe and said, Joe, what should I say? I'm consulting all of these important people in terms of my role as a practicing moral philosopher in the committee. And Joe said absolutely the correct things. Tell them to pay taxes. Yes, a socialist wants to pay taxes. You see, this is the idea that nobody can understand today in the United States. It's taxpayers' money. What is it for? So what are they for? So it's not, this is how Marx and Engels write in Class Struggles in France. It's about elections. It's about voting. It's about, and especially Engels, as I say, 1895, when Marx is dead, he's talking about what the party should really understand. It is about paying taxes, fiscal stuff. So this is, they're not writing about revolution. This is something that people don't understand. I was saying just yesterday in public about the 1872, with you, the 1872 introduction to Communist Manifesto, which is the last thing that they wrote, 1872. And it said, ignore the sections on revolution. They are altered because big business has gone. I'm almost quoting verbatim in English, of course. The big business has gone too far in those last 25 years, so that everything we said about the revolution is wrong.
Yeah.
And so we are keeping it exactly as it is, because it's an iconic text, and therefore we haven't changed anything. But please read it as an icon, and don't think this can be followed. So this, and after that, they write about form. Marx writes, Engels is not as counterintuitive as Marx, but this, he constantly corrects, and Marx constantly puts it in the footnote, he constantly puts it back. And the American anti-capitalists actually follow the Engels stuff.
Right.
Use value, exchange value, living labor, dead labor, etc. But the thing is that, so after that, it is form, and that's why Marx says that the value form is contentless. Einfach und inhaltlos. Inhaltlos means form. How can he say form? Because he's a communist, he can't be a formalist. So therefore he says contentless. It's very sweet. But the thing is, that's why, this whole question of what is a revolution, what is enforcement of laws, etc., has to be looked at exactly in the way that you're suggesting now. And those people, legal scholars and humanities folks, who think our way. I think we are a collectivity, far-flung, but we are a collectivity. We are kind of the new international. I don't want to go any further.
That sounds really good to me,
Yeah.
but I just want to backtrack a little bit about what you said about Nordic exceptionalism. Because talking with you yesterday, you chastised me, quite rightly, for using this really completely inaccurate terms, the global north and the global south.
Not inaccurate, prejudice.
Yeah, prejudice. And of course, they're not, because of course, I mean, they cover over the enormous heterogeneity and the inequalities that are within both kind of like spaces.
Yes, they ignore the north and the south and the south and the north.
Yes.
And therefore globalization can go forward. The people in India, as she knows, we call dipsos, dollar income private sector. They are ignored if you do global south.
But your work, Daniela, because that addresses exactly those inequalities within the Nordic countries in a very kind of striking way, addressing, for example, the forced sterilization of certain groups of people in several Nordic countries over a period of 100 years. You're addressing the lack of rights for trans people, or if trans people do have rights, how family laws are kind of turning those rights upside down when it comes to like how you organize a family. And in your recent work, you also talk about land rights for the Sami population. And I wondered if you could tell us a little bit more about this work, and maybe perhaps start with the sterilization question. I went to the store to get your book, but I didn't have it in. I asked them to order it and said, but it's expensive, so expensive. So I said, okay, I'll just go to the library and have them find it instead. But I saw that chapter 4 is about Norway.
Yes.
And the title is Ethnic Cleansing, ? Can you tell me what you mean by that title?
Yes. Okay. So in that particular context, I think, thank you for the question. I mean, it's of course addressing many themes. I don't know. Let's see how far we get. But the chapter on Norway. So I look at in the book Grievance Formation, Rights and Remedies. I look at sterilization practices and practices of forced sterilization and castration, focusing on international law, international human rights law, and also Norway, Sweden, and Finland in particular, and sort of contextually looking really into both the historical sterilizations and castrations. So the historical sterilizations often targeted women who were poor, women who belonged to ethnic minorities and ethnic minorities in general, or especially the traveler community. Then also, but just these kind of poor, exhausted mothers, a term I can relate to also myself these days. But it was, and generally this kind of women who were seen as exhausted, that shouldn't have children, or women who had children outside of marriage. That was also an important category. And also, of course, people with disabilities, even though the notion of disability has changed quite a lot if you look at the 30s until now. So it's not maybe what we would consider as disability today, but it was kind of, there was this talk of feeble-mindedness also in the US, was very much the same thing. There's this infamous case, Buck versus Bell, also about where the Supreme Court justice was also, the decision was saying that, I think I'm quoting more or less correctly or incorrectly, that 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. So there was this notion, which was also in the Nordic countries at the time, that motivated, and eugenics, that motivated sterilization laws and castration laws, were targeting people who were considered sexually deviant or sexually dangerous. So that was also quite a diverse group in many ways. Also including men who have sex with men to some extent. So those are the more historical, so looking from the 1930s to 1970s, but then also looking at more contemporary practices of sterilization and where sterilization is used or has been used as a condition to get legal gender recognition for trans people. So from the 1970s largely until really very recent years, just in 2023, this sterilization precondition was abolished in Finland. And in 2016, the Norwegian law was changed. Why do I use ethnic cleansing in the chapter on Norway? It is because, so in the Norwegian, because I look at not just how these practices were established, I'm also very interested, and particularly interested in how they were abolished, and whether there have been any kinds of remedies to the survivors of these practices, right? So in the Norwegian context, it is interesting. I look at framing and how these, particularly the historical sterilizations, were mobilized around also by the Romani community, and how that also then stirred, how that led to initiatives to investigate former state policies and state practices concerning forced sterilization. But it was always framed, well, first it was framed as kind of potentially as ethnic cleansing, which is, of course, a term that we know from genocide. And, of course, sterilization can be a way of perpetrating genocide. But because, and also now relating to what we see happening today, especially in Palestine, we see that the legal criteria for genocide are extremely high and maybe almost impossible for any kinds of actions to qualify as genocide, especially when it comes to this genocidal intent. That happened also in Norway, so quite soon. It was also concluded that, well, this wasn't really genocidal practice.
There will be no genocide.
Indeed. No ethnic cleansing.
There we go.
Indeed. So, but this ethnic framing really stayed with the way that the whole question was framed in Norway. So actually, in Norway still today, the only group that has received extraordinary reparations, so compensation for forced sterilization, is the Romani survivors of sterilization. Or there was a compensation scheme. It was not. It was, of course, established very late. So in the 2000s, it was not used by many in the end. But we know for a fact, looking at historical research, that there were many more people affected by these practices, and that has not really been part of the official way of framing this. And it has always kind of also kept this notion of exceptionalism around it, because then when also looking at these more contemporary practices of sterilization requirements for trans people who wanted to amend legal gender, it has often been considered that you cannot compare the two, because whilst in Sweden, for example, where there was a broader framing, it was considered that you can compare historical sterilizations and contemporary sterilizations, because sterilizations were often used as a way to access a right. So to access, for example, social benefits back in the days, or to have custody of one's children, or to get an abortion many times. So that is why I have that. Why that is the title of the Norwegian chapter.
You should publish the book through Seagull Press at a cheap price. There are fine Indian bookstore which has resisted conglomerates, remained an independent bookstore located in Calcutta with worldwide distribution. you publish an edition with them at a cheaper price.
Yeah.
And their books are beautiful.
Yeah.
You know, they're designed by a woman who's won prizes at the Frankfurt Book Fair, etc. You look at those books and you want to hold them in your hands. You do that.
Yeah.
Because of,
I think that's very good advice.
Lots of people will read it then.
Yeah.
You know.
Because, of course, that's a big problem in today's
It's a big
academia
problem.
and publishing, that,
You know?
that access to information is...
And you know, I'll tell you, I mean, I'm just telling stories. You are the theoretical person. That's what I wanted to hear now. But humanities people tell stories. In 1994, as I was saying in my talk, the UN opened itself to non-governmental institutions. There was an NGO forum in Cairo at the conference on population. Population control, really. I went as a member of a Bangladeshi NGO, Pravartana, and I was with Farida Akhtar, who's now a minister under Yunus. She's wonderful, wonderful global feminist, tiny, but... And so Farida and I are in this, of course we are for, the real call was for legalization of abortion. And of course we were for it. I mean, there was no question that we were for it. But we were also saying, look also in what we would call the global south, you look also there, pharmaceutical dumping, enforced sterilization, and also, I mean, on both sides, etc. And you know what happened? I mean, I respect Bella Abzug, but we were in that group talking, and of course we had to be a little shrill. First of all, is because Farida's voice is high, and for me, because nobody was listening to us. So, I mean, we were shut up by saying, consensus breakers, consensus breakers. So from that era also, again, you should put that in. It's not just in Norway.
Yeah,
no,
definitely.
you know, this pharmaceutical dumping is still going on.
Yes.
And it is even in the field of agriculture, right? So that it's not just women's bodies, but the earth's body, as it were. Sorry for using a romantic phrase, but, you know, so therefore, it seems to me that that work can be expanded a great deal, and I can talk about it if there's a cheap edition. You see, that's what I mean by activist humanities work. You know?
No, I think it's definitely true, and that's also part of what led me to, and of course I just look at these three contexts because I sort of have also best knowledge of those, and they are sort of, in a sense, you know, you can compare them. They are comparable in that sense. But as you say, it's definitely not limited, and that's also something I'm writing in the book to the Nordic countries. It has happened in many countries, and I think the more I investigated the topic, the more cases I heard of and the more stories I heard of. And as you say, reproductive rights have been, to some extent, I think, also monopolized maybe by the question of abortion. Of course, access to abortion is very important. It's an important question for reproductive rights. But of course, for some, and especially for many groups of what we would maybe call marginalized women, that was reproductive rights was more about the right to actually have children. I mean, depending on the context, but it's important, and I think these practices haven't gotten the attention that they deserve of forced reproductive practices to actually limit many people's reproduction.
And you see, what people also don't realize is that if there is no social security, the only thing is to have children.
Yeah.
You know,
Yes.
I mean, the question is not confined to children or having children. The question is actually expanded into providing social security. It is only then that one can think about legal reproductive rights, etc. So this is something that no one talks about. And it seems to me, as we expand from Europe, this is something that one should, because that's where whatever little work I do in those very poor areas in India, this is so obvious. I used to work with the paramedics of Zafrullah Chaudhuri, who just died. And I mean, Zafrullah Chaudhuri surely should have received a Nobel Prize at some point. But anyway, he just died. And his paramedics were so fine, rural women paramedics, and Zafrullah sent me with them as a test to see if I could bear to be, because he distrusted me. And you see, that's the thing that I learned from looking at people having children. That's where I learned it in the 80s. There's no social security. This is marriage in Jane Austen. No social security. It's something that nobody talks about. And I think it's very important to talk about that.
And of course, like, your take on it also brings up a lot of the question, like, about human rights more generally, and what you need to do to access a certain kind of right that is called human as if it was universal. But of course it's not. And I know you have been writing critically about human rights, and you have been writing critical about human rights. Now I see we have 1 minute left. But you just want to say 2 sentences about that, because I think that's also a very...
I think, I mean, I'll be just very brief, so it won't be the whole thing. The idea of inalienable human rights, it was appropriately in the context of what has been called the bourgeois revolution. Okay, but bourgeois revolution sounds very odd in English. It's bad, and it's opposed to proletarian revolution. And then also in French it sounds awful, because the real word is, of course, bürgerliche Gesellschaft. And bürgerlich is citizenly. And that's what, after all, the Marseillaise says to the sans-culottes, aux armes, citoyens. They all became citoyen Marx, and citoyen Napoleon is what Toussaint Louverture called Napoleon. But the thing is, that human subject doesn't exist elsewhere. So that human rights look simply like top-down philanthropy that the tyrants give. And that subject is based on, now I'm a literary person, therefore I've given my life to fiction. I don't think fiction is the opposite of truth. Underived fiction. The idea of the unalienable human rights is an underived fiction. A positive fiction, because it isn't really realistically true. But we need it. But we can't use it in those parts of the world where the subject of the Bürgerliche Revolution was not produced. You know, so you can't use it with subalterns, ungeneralizable. They have no citizenship rights. So to do human rights with them is exactly like what the tyrants do. So therefore, that's just a little more than 2 sentences. It took me not long. Okay, no.
Yeah, unfortunately our time has gone. I will give you a couple of words at the end.
Okay, I will just be very brief. So I definitely wholeheartedly agree with that. And I think that we always have to ask ourselves, you know, who is the human of human rights? And there is always this imagined legal subject that I think not just that it cannot be used just in some contexts and not others. I think also even within, I mean, those countries where it originates from, it was always limited to those in power and not for everyone. So that is, yeah, who is the human of human rights, and what are those rights seen as central?
I think here we have material for many articles to come. Some
it's
of them
been
you
such a pleasure
actually
for me
have
to have this agreement between the Nils Klim and the Holberg. That's wonderful. Thank you so much for being what you are.
Thank you. And I was so happy when the Holberg Prize was announced that I would get to meet you.
There we are. There we are. You see, this is so wonderful. I think the Holberg people should keep it like this, that there should be a connection between
Yes.
the Nils Klim and the older person.
The feminists
Okay,
take
give
the
them all the
prizes.
feminists. Give the feminists a big hand.